In December 1937, the ancient capital of China became a graveyard. Nanking was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. It was a city filled with civilians, refugees, families who believed the war would pass them by. What followed was not conquest. It was annihilation. The path to Nanking was paved with brutality long before the first Japanese soldier entered the city. Japan's war in China had begun years earlier, driven by imperial ambition and a belief in racial superiority. The Japanese military had been conditioned to see surrender as weakness and civilians as expendable. Mercy was not part of their doctrine. Violence was discipline. Fear was strategy. After the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July 1937, full-scale war erupted between China and Japan. Japanese forces advanced rapidly, overwhelming poorly equipped Chinese armies. City after city fell. Shanghai resisted fiercely, turning into a blood-soaked battleground that shocked the world. When Shanghai finally collapsed in November, the road to Nanking lay open. Nanking was more than a military target. It was the capital of the Republic of China. Its fall would be symbolic, psychological, and devastating. As Japanese troops marched inland, panic spread through the city. Government officials fled. Military leaders withdrew. What remained behind were civilians, missionaries, foreign diplomats, women, children, and the elderly. More than 500,000 refugees poured into Nanking from surrounding regions, escaping earlier massacres. The city was already overcrowded, strained beyond its limits. Food was scarce. Order was fragile. Yet many believed that Nanking would be spared. It was, after all, an open city. There would be no defense. No resistance. Surrender would mean survival. They were wrong. As Japanese divisions closed in, Chinese troops attempted a chaotic retreat. Discipline collapsed. Some soldiers discarded uniforms and blended into civilian crowds, hoping to escape. This act would later be used as justification for mass executions. In the eyes of the invaders, every man became a suspect. Every body became disposable. On December 10, Japanese artillery began pounding the city. Shells tore through neighborhoods, hospitals, and refugee camps. Fire spread uncontrollably. The sound of explosions mixed with screams and prayers. 2 days later, on December 12, Chinese resistance crumbled. Commanders abandoned their posts. Thousands of soldiers fled toward the Yangtze River, only to find escape blocked. Many drowned. Others were hunted down. On December 13, 1937, Japanese troops entered Nanking. What followed was not chaos born of war. It was organized, systematic violence. Officers did not stop their men. In many cases, they encouraged them. The city was declared conquered, and with that declaration, all restraint vanished. Men were rounded up in groups, tied together, led to riverbanks, fields, and courtyards. Machine guns opened fire. Bayonets finished the wounded. Bodies were stacked like cargo. Some were buried alive. Others were burned. Estimates vary, but historians agree that tens of thousands of men were executed within days. Women fared no better. Rape became weaponized. Girls as young as 8. Women in their 70s. Mothers assaulted in front of children. Daughters raped beside dying parents. Many victims were murdered afterward to erase witnesses. Others were killed simply because the soldiers were finished. Homes were looted. Temples desecrated. Entire families slaughtered for sport. Soldiers held contests to see who could kill the most people with a sword. Photographs were taken. Letters were written home boasting of the carnage. Nanking ceased to be a city. It became a killing ground. For 6 weeks, the violence continued. Day and night. Without pause. Without consequence. The world knew something was happening, but the scale was beyond comprehension. Diplomats documented it. Missionaries filmed it. Survivors whispered it. But Nanking was drowning in blood, and no one came to stop it. This was not an accident of war. This was the rape of Nanking. And the worst was still unfolding. Once the gates of Nanking fell, the city entered a state beyond war. There were no front lines, no objectives, no strategy left to pursue. What followed was 6 weeks of unrestrained violence, carried out not in secrecy, but in full view of the world. Japanese troops moved through the city block by block. Any man suspected of being a former soldier was seized. In practice, this meant nearly every male between the ages of 15 and 60. They were dragged from homes, shelters, hospitals, and refugee camps. Identification did not matter. Proof was irrelevant. Survival depended on chance alone. Groups of prisoners were marched to execution sites along the Yangtze River, to abandoned quarries, schoolyards, temple courtyards, and open fields. There, they were bound together with rope or wire. Machine guns tore through their bodies. When ammunition ran low, bayonets and swords were used instead. Soldiers practiced thrusts and decapitations on living men. Some victims were buried alive beneath shallow graves that moved for hours. Entire neighborhoods were empty. Streets filled with corpses. The river itself became a mass grave, clogged with bodies drifting downstream. Fishermen later described pulling up nets filled with human remains instead of fish. For women, the terror was constant and intimate. Rape was not a crime, it was routine. Soldiers broke into homes, dragged women into alleys, stairwells, and empty buildings. Resistance meant death. Compliance often meant death anyway. Many women were raped repeatedly by dozens of men over hours or days. Some were mutilated. Some were killed afterward with bayonets to silence them. Once the gates of Nanking fell, the city entered a state beyond war. There were no front lines, no objectives, no strategy left to pursue. What followed was 6 weeks of unrestrained violence, carried out not in secrecy, but in full view of the world. Japanese troops moved through the city block by block. Any man suspected of being a former soldier was seized. In practice, this meant nearly every male between the ages of 15 and 60. They were dragged from homes, shelters, hospitals, and refugee camps. Identification did not matter. Proof was irrelevant. Survival depended on chance alone. Groups of prisoners were marched to execution sites along the Yangtze River, to abandoned quarries, schoolyards, temple courtyards, and open fields. There, they were bound together with rope or wire. Machine guns tore through their bodies. When ammunition ran low, bayonets and swords were used instead. Soldiers practiced thrusts and decapitations on living men. Some victims were buried alive beneath shallow graves that moved for hours. Entire neighborhoods were empty. Streets filled with corpses. The river itself became a mass grave, clogged with bodies drifting downstream. Fishermen later described pulling up nets filled with human remains instead of fish. For women, the terror was constant and intimate. Rape was not a crime, it was routine. Soldiers broke into homes, dragged women into alleys, stairwells, and empty buildings. Resistance meant death. Compliance often meant death anyway. Many women were raped repeatedly by dozens of men over hours or days. Some were mutilated. Some were killed afterward with bayonets to silence them. But the safety zone was not safe. Japanese soldiers entered it repeatedly. They abducted women at night, executed men accused of being soldiers, dragged people out by force. The zone reduced the death toll, but it did not stop the horror. Outside its boundaries, Nanking rotted. Bodies lay unburied for weeks. The smell of death became permanent. Disease spread. Dogs fed on corpses. Survivors scavenged for food among ruins and bodies alike. Hunger followed violence, tightening its grip on those who remained. By January 1938, the killing began to slow, not because mercy returned, but because there was little left to destroy. The city was broken. Its population shattered. Its soul crushed. When Japanese command finally restored order, they did not investigate crimes. They erased evidence. Photographs disappeared. Reports were suppressed. Soldiers rotated out and reassigned elsewhere. carrying their experiences with them like a disease spreading across Asia. Nanking was no longer just a tragedy. It was a warning. A demonstration of what happens when war removes all limits, when ideology replaces humanity, when civilians become targets by design. And still, the full truth had not yet emerged. Because after the blood dried, a second battle began. A battle over memory, denial, and silence. When the guns fell silent in Nanking, the killing did not truly end. What followed was quieter, colder, and just as devastating, the erasure of truth. In the weeks after order was restored, Japanese authorities moved quickly to control the narrative. Foreign journalists were expelled. Photographs were confiscated. Reports were dismissed as exaggerations or enemy propaganda. Soldiers who had participated in mass executions and sexual violence were redeployed, scattered across the expanding fronts of the war. No investigations were launched. No trials were held. For the survivors, there was no justice, only survival. Those who remained in Nanking returned to ruins. Entire families had vanished. Homes were piles of ash. The living searched for the dead among mass graves, along riverbanks, and in collapsed buildings. Many never found bodies at all. The Yangtze had carried them away. Women who survived rape faced lifelong trauma and social stigma. Many never spoke of what happened. In a society already torn apart by war, silence became a form of self-preservation. Children who witnessed the killings grew up carrying memories they could not name. Meanwhile, the world moved on. In 1946, after the war ended, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo Trials, addressed Japanese war crimes. The Nanking Massacre was included. Testimonies were heard. Documents were presented. Estimates of the dead ranged from 200,000 to over 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war. General Matsui Iwai, commander of the Central China Area Army, was found guilty of war crimes and executed. Several other officers were sentenced, but for many, it was not enough. Thousands of perpetrators were never identified. Entire units vanished into history. Responsibility dissolved upward and outward, buried beneath bureaucracy and post-war reconstruction. In Japan, memory fractured. Some textbooks mentioned Nanking briefly. Others avoided it entirely. Politicians debated numbers instead of crimes. Nationalists denied the massacre outright, calling it a fabrication. Others admitted incidents but rejected the scale. The argument was no longer about what happened, but whether it happened at all. This denial reopened wounds. For China, Nanking became a symbol of national trauma. A reminder of humiliation, suffering, and foreign aggression. Each denial felt like a second violation. Each minimization, a continuation of violence by other means. Survivors spoke when they could. Diaries resurfaced. Photographs re-emerged. John Robb's journals were published decades later, confirming the horror in chilling detail. Missionary films showed mass graves and wounded civilians. Japanese veterans themselves, in rare moments of honesty, admitted what they had seen and done. Yet denial persisted, but the truth does not vanish. It lives in mass graves beneath modern streets. In photographs too brutal to forget. In testimonies whispered and shouted across generations. In memorials built not to inflame hatred, but to prevent forgetting. Nanking stands as one of the clearest examples of how quickly humanity can collapse when power goes unchecked and civilians are stripped of value. It shows that atrocity does not require monsters, only obedience, dehumanization, and silence. The city was raped once by soldiers, and then again by denial. Remembering Nanking is not about vengeance. It is about responsibility. About confronting the past honestly, no matter how uncomfortable, so it cannot be repeated under a different name, in a different place. Because the most dangerous lie is not that atrocities never happened. It is that they could never happen again. History often speaks in numbers. Dates. Casualty estimates. Military movements. But Nanking is not a statistic. It is a warning carved into the memory of humanity. What happened in December 1937 was not an accident of war. It was not chaos spiraling out of control. It was the result of ideology, dehumanization, and absolute power placed in the hands of men who believed mercy was weakness and civilians were expendable. For 6 weeks, an ancient city became a killing ground. Not because it resisted, but because it surrendered. This is what makes Nanking so terrifying. The victims were not soldiers on a battlefield. They were teachers, farmers, children, merchants, mothers. People who believed that laying down arms would spare their lives. People who trusted that surrender still meant something. They were wrong. The massacre revealed how fragile civilization truly is. How quickly laws, morals, and customs collapse when authority rewards brutality. When obedience becomes more important than conscience. When propaganda convinces men that others are less than human. Nanking was not unique. It belongs to the same dark lineage as the Holocaust, Armenia, Rwanda, Cambodia. Different languages. Different uniforms. The same pattern. The same silence before the screams. And the same question afterward. How could this happen? The answer is uncomfortable. Because it does not lie only in history, it lies in human nature. Atrocities do not begin with murder. They begin with words. With labels. With the slow erosion of empathy. With the idea that some lives matter less. With the belief that orders erase responsibility. The soldiers who entered Nanking were not born executioners. They were shaped, trained, conditioned, rewarded for cruelty, shielded from consequence. And when the killing ended, many returned home, started families, lived normal lives. The world they destroyed remained buried beneath their silence. For the survivors, there was no return to normal. Trauma passed from parents to children. Memories became inherited scars. Even today, voices shake when recounting what was seen, what was endured, what was lost. The dead of Nanking cannot speak. So the living must. Remembering Nanking is not about assigning eternal guilt to nations or peoples. It is about recognizing how systems fail, and how easily humanity slips when hatred is normalized and accountability disappears. Memory is not revenge. Memory is defense. Every generation that forgets Nanking risks repeating it. Not in the same city. Not under the same flag. But with the same justifications. The same excuses. The same indifference. The city was buried once under blood and fire. Let it never be buried again, under denial and silence. Because the true legacy of Nanking is not only how humanity fell, but whether it dares to stand again.